The elevator lurched to a stop between the 14th and 15th floors, and Alina Chen pressed her forehead against the cool metal wall, watching the emergency button blink red in the dim overhead light. Through the speaker, she could hear Marcus from maintenance apologizing profusely, his voice crackling with static as he explained that the repair crew would need at least 40 minutes to get them moving again. "Ma'am, are you okay in there?" His voice carried genuine concern, the kind she'd grown to appreciate during her 3 years working in the Meridian Financial Tower. "I'm fine, Marcus," she called back, though her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her worn leather briefcase. Inside that case were documents that could change everything, or destroy everything she'd spent the last decade building. "Just take your time." The elevator's fluorescent light flickered, casting shadows that danced across the mirrored walls. In the distorted reflection, Alina could see herself clearly, a 34-year-old woman in a navy blazer that cost more than most people made in a week, clutching secrets that weighed more than the building itself. Her black hair was pulled back in the same precise bun she'd worn every day for 3 years, not because she lacked imagination, but because consistency was armor in a world that questioned every choice she made. 43 minutes ago, she'd been sitting in her corner office on the 22nd floor, reviewing quarterly reports with the kind of methodical precision that had earned her the senior financial analyst position at Hartwell and Associates. The morning sun had streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes that floated like tiny dancers above her mahogany desk, a desk she'd chosen not for its price tag, but because it reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen table, where she'd learned that numbers could tell stories if you knew how to listen. Then Jessica had knocked. Jessica Winters, her administrative assistant for 8 months, had stood in the doorway with a peculiar expression. Not quite guilt, not quite defiance, but something that made Alina's stomach clench with recognition. She'd seen that look before, in boardrooms and coffee shops, in the eyes of colleagues who smiled while calculating her worth. "Alina, I need to talk to you about something," Jessica had said, her voice carrying a tremor that seemed practiced rather than genuine. Behind her, Alina could see the familiar bustle of the office, Ryan from accounting hurrying past with his arms full of files, the soft murmur of phone conversations blending with the hum of computers and printers, the gentle clink of coffee cups being set down on desks. Jessica had closed the door and taken the seat across from Alina's desk, her manicured fingers drumming against her notebook, the same notebook where she dutifully recorded meeting notes and phone messages for months. The morning light caught the small diamond in her engagement ring, a ring she'd shown off proudly just 2 weeks ago when her boyfriend had proposed during a weekend trip to Napa Valley. "I made a mistake," Jessica had begun, and Alina had felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever someone started a conversation with those words. In her experience, mistakes were rarely accidental, especially when they began with such careful preambles. "What kind of mistake?" Alina had asked, though something in Jessica's posture, the way she sat too straight, the way her eyes kept darting to the door, told her this wasn't about a missed appointment or a misfiled document. "I was having lunch with Sarah from HR yesterday," Jessica had continued, referring to Sarah Martinez, a woman Alina knew primarily through brief elevator conversations and the occasional company-wide email. "And we were talking about salary equity. And I mentioned your salary package." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and acrid. Alina had felt her pulse quicken, though she'd kept her expression neutral, another skill learned through years of board meetings where showing emotion was perceived as weakness. "You mentioned my salary to someone in HR," Alina had repeated slowly, buying time to process the implications. Her compensation wasn't exactly classified information, but it wasn't water cooler conversation either. "Not just the salary," Jessica had admitted, and now her voice carried the weight of someone confessing to a crime. "The full package, the bonus structure, the stock options, everything. Sarah was talking about pay disparities, and I just wanted to contribute to the conversation." Alina had remained silent, watching Jessica's face for tells. The slight flush in her cheeks, the way she bit her lower lip, the nervous energy that radiated from her like heat from asphalt on a summer day. In that moment, Alina had understood something fundamental about human nature. People didn't accidentally reveal confidential information. They chose to, and then they convinced themselves it was a mistake. Sarah seemed shocked, Jessica had continued, as if the admission was being pulled from her by invisible strings. She said she had no idea that someone at my level, at your level, was making that much. She said it seemed like a lot for someone who's only been here 3 years. The criticism had been delivered with surgical precision, wrapped in the guise of Sarah's observation, but clearly reflecting Jessica's own feelings. Alina had recognized the technique. She'd seen it used in boardrooms and performance reviews. The art of delivering judgment while maintaining plausible deniability. What exactly did Sarah say? Alina had asked, though she suspected she already knew. In her 3 years at Hartwell and Associates, she'd heard variations of the same theme. She was too young, too new, too something to deserve her position and the compensation that came with it. Jessica had shifted in her chair, and for a moment, Alina had seen something that looked like genuine regret flicker across her features. She said it didn't seem fair to other employees who'd been here longer. She mentioned that people might start asking questions. What kind of questions? About how you got promoted so quickly, about whether there were other factors involved. The implication had settled between them like a third person in the room, invisible but undeniably present. Other factors. In Alina's experience, those 2 words were code for everything from nepotism to more unsavory suggestions about how women advanced in corporate environments. I see, Alina had said. Though she saw was a carefully orchestrated revelation designed to undermine her credibility while allowing Jessica to position herself as the reluctant messenger. What exactly do you think, Jessica? Do you think there were other factors? The question had been a test, and Jessica had failed it by hesitating too long before answering. I think you're very good at your job, she had said finally. But the words carried the hollow ring of diplomacy rather than conviction. But 3 years does seem fast for such a significant role. There it was, the real message delivered with the subtlety of a scalpel. Alina had nodded slowly, processing not just the words, but the entire interaction, the careful staging of concern and regret that barely concealed something more calculated. Thank you for telling me, she had said, though she had meant the opposite. Jessica's revelation wasn't information, it was ammunition, designed to create doubt and suspicion where none had existed before. After Jessica had left, Alina had sat alone in her office, staring out at the city sprawling below. From her 22nd floor vantage point, she could see the river winding through downtown like a silver ribbon, the morning traffic creating patterns of light that shifted and flowed with hypnotic regularity. Somewhere in those patterns was her truth, a truth that Jessica and Sarah, and probably others, couldn't see because they were too busy calculating her worth based on their own limited understanding of how success worked. She'd opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder she rarely looked at. A thick manila envelope secured with a red string tie, the kind used for legal documents. Inside were papers that told a different story than the one Jessica had shared at lunch. Documents that would reframe every assumption about her position and her right to occupy it. But those papers came with their own complications, their own risks. Revealing them would answer questions about her qualifications while raising entirely new ones about her motivations. It would solve one problem while creating others, and Alina had learned long ago that sometimes the cure was worse than the disease. Now, trapped between floors in an elevator that smelled faintly of coffee and industrial cleaner,
she found herself holding those same documents, feeling their weight in her hands like a loaded weapon she wasn't sure she had the courage to use. The elevator shuddered slightly, and Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker again. "Ma'am, we've got the repair crew on site. Should have you moving in about 20 minutes. "Thank you, Marcus," she replied, though part of her welcomed the forced pause. Sometimes clarity came in unexpected moments, in the space between floors, in the silence between heartbeats, in the breath between decisions that could change everything. She thought about her grandmother, who died when Alina was 26, leaving behind a legacy of quiet strength and carefully kept secrets. Her grandmother had understood that truth was a luxury not everyone could afford, and that sometimes survival required strategic patience rather than immediate justice. But her grandmother had also taught her that silence was a choice, and choices had consequences. Every day Alina chose not to reveal the contents of her briefcase was a day she allowed others to control the narrative about her worth and her place in the world. The documents rustled as she shifted them in her lap again, and she caught sight of her reflection in the elevator's mirrored wall again. This time, she didn't see uncertainty or fear. She saw a woman holding the power to rewrite every assumption, every whispered conversation, every calculated leak designed to diminish her. The question was whether she was ready to use that power, knowing that once she did, there would be no going back to the comfortable anonymity she'd cultivated for 3 years. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The elevator lurched slightly as the repair crew began their work above, and Alina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of possibility settling around her like a second skin. 20 minutes later, Alina emerged from the elevator to find the 22nd floor buzzing with an energy that felt different from the usual pre-lunch productivity. Conversations seemed to pause as she walked past, resuming in whispers once she'd moved beyond earshot. The subtle shift in atmosphere told her everything she needed to know about how quickly Jessica's lunch conversation had propagated through the office ecosystem. She settled at her desk and opened her laptop, letting muscle memory guide her through the familiar routine of checking emails and reviewing market reports. But her attention kept drifting to the sounds around her, the soft ping of instant messages being sent between colleagues, the slightly too casual tone of conversations that stopped when she approached the coffee station, the way people's eyes followed her movements with a new kind of curiosity. At 12:47 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from her college roommate, Maya, who worked across town at a competing firm. "Heard through the grapevine that your salary is causing some waves. You okay?" Alina stared at the message, feeling a familiar knot form in her stomach. If Maya had heard something, it meant the conversation had jumped from Hartwell and Associates to the broader financial community, a development that transformed a workplace gossip session into something with real professional consequences. She typed back, "Just office politics, nothing I can't handle."
But even as she sent the message, she wondered if that were true. Office politics operated by rules she'd never fully mastered, requiring a kind of social navigation that felt foreign to someone who preferred the concrete logic of numbers and financial models. Her desk phone rang, pulling her attention back to immediate concerns. "Alina Chen?" "Miss Chen, this is David Hartwell's office," came the crisp voice of Margaret Thompson, the senior partner's longtime assistant. "Mr. Hartwell would like to see you at 3:30 this afternoon." The formal tone made Alina's pulse quicken. In 3 years at the firm, she'd had exactly 4 one-on-one meetings with David Hartwell, each memorable for both its brevity and its precision. Hartwell was a man who measured words like a pharmacist measured medication, every syllable calculated for maximum effect. "Of course," Alina replied. "Should I prepare anything specific?" "Just bring yourself," Margaret said, though something in her tone suggested the meeting would be anything but casual. After hanging up, Alina opened her desk drawer and pulled out the small leather journal she'd kept since her first day at the firm. It was a habit inherited from her grandmother, who'd recorded everything from grocery lists to philosophical observations in a series of identical black notebooks. Write it down, her grandmother used to say, because memory is the first casualty of strong emotions. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, 3:30 meeting with DH, day after Jessica's revelation. Coincidence? The question mark felt important. A reminder that assumptions, even logical ones, could be dangerous when career and reputation were at stake. Alina's morning routine had always been a kind of meditation, a series of precisely timed actions that created structure in a world that often felt chaotic. She woke at 5:45 a.m. in her downtown apartment, a one-bedroom space she'd chosen not for its luxury, but for its proximity to the office and the small balcony that offered a view of the river. The first thing she did each morning was make coffee using beans she ordered from a small roastery in Portland, a small indulgence that reminded her that not everything valuable had to be practical. While the coffee brewed, she spent 15 minutes reading financial news, not because she needed to stay informed, that was part of her job, but because the ritual of consuming information in measured doses helped her feel prepared for whatever the day might bring. She'd learned early in her career that confidence often came not from knowing everything, but from knowing how to find what you needed when you needed it. Her commute was a 12-minute walk through downtown Portland, a route she'd mapped to include exactly one stop at Rosa's Corner Market, where she bought a banana and exchanged pleasantries with Rosa Delgado, an elderly woman who'd immigrated from Mexico 40 years ago and built a small empire of local connections through her store. Rosa never asked what Alina did for work, never commented on her clothes or her schedule, but always had a warm smile and a few words about the weather or the neighborhood. "You look tired today, mija," Rosa had said that morning, handing Alina her usual banana. "Everything okay?" "Just work stuff," Alina had replied, surprised by how accurately Rosa had read her mood. "You know how it is." "I know that worrying about things you can't control is like watering weeds," Rosa had said with a knowing smile. "Better to tend your own garden." Now, sitting in her office with David Hartwell's meeting looming, Alina found herself thinking about Rosa's words. What was her garden exactly? What had she been cultivating during her 3 years at Hartwell and Associates, and what weeds had she been inadvertently watering with her silence? The truth is, she'd built her professional identity around being underestimated. There was a strange comfort in having people assume she was lucky rather than capable because it meant they never saw her coming. While colleagues spent energy on office politics and positioning, she'd focused on doing work that spoke for itself, analyzing market trends, identifying investment opportunities, building models that consistently outperformed benchmarks. But that strategy had a fatal flaw. It required other people to eventually notice and acknowledge her competence, and humans, she was learning, were remarkably adept at maintaining their preferred narratives, even in the face of contrary evidence. She thought about her trajectory to this position, the careful steps that had brought her from a state school economics degree to a senior analyst role at one of Portland's most prestigious firms. Each promotion had felt earned through long hours and precise work. But she'd also understood that perception mattered as much as performance in corporate environments. During her first year, she'd made the mistake of correcting a senior partner's math during a client presentation. She'd been right. The projected returns he'd cited were off by nearly 2 percentage points. But being right had mattered less than being diplomatic. The correction had earned her a reputation for competence, but also for being difficult to manage. She'd learned to deliver corrections through questions rather than statements. Have we considered the impact of currency fluctuations on these projections instead of, these numbers don't account for currency risk? It was a small linguistic shift that preserved egos while ensuring accuracy, a translation between technical truth and political reality. But even careful diplomacy couldn't completely shield her from the inevitable questions about how she'd advanced so quickly. The whispers had started after her first promotion and intensified with each subsequent recognition. She was too young, too new, too something to deserve her success by traditional metrics. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, except the lawyers who'd handled the paperwork, was that traditional metrics didn't apply to someone in her unique position. Alina opened her briefcase and pulled out the red-tied folder, setting it on her desk like a chess piece she wasn't ready to move.
Inside were documents that would recontextualize every assumption about her career, every whispered speculation about her qualifications, every careful leak designed to undermine her credibility. But they would also reveal information she'd spent 3 years protecting, information that would change how everyone saw her and how she moved through the world. There was a reason she'd kept the documents secured in her briefcase rather than displayed in her office, a reason she'd chosen anonymity over vindication. Her phone buzzed with another text, this time from an unknown number. "Heard about the salary drama. Probably time people knew the whole truth, don't you think?" Alina stared at the message, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the office's aggressive air conditioning. Someone knew about the documents, or at least suspected their existence. The question was whether this was a threat or an encouragement, and from whom. She deleted the message without responding, but the damage had been done. The careful isolation she'd maintained around her secret was developing cracks, and cracks had a way of spreading under pressure. At 3:15 p.m., she gathered her briefcase and headed for the elevator, passing Jessica's desk on the way. Her assistant looked up with an expression that managed to convey both apology and curiosity, as if she were simultaneously sorry for creating the situation and eager to see how it would unfold. "Good luck with your meeting," Jessica said, though something in her tone suggested she already knew what the meeting would be about. "Thank you," Alina replied, though she wondered if luck would be enough to navigate what was coming. As she waited for the elevator, the same elevator that had trapped her that morning, she thought about the different versions of truth that would soon be competing for dominance. There was Jessica's version, filtered through Sarah's perspective and whatever gossip network had carried the story beyond the office walls. There was David Hartwell's version, which would prioritize the firm's reputation and client relationships above individual fairness. And there was her version, locked away in a folder that felt heavier with each passing hour.
The elevator doors opened, and Alina stepped inside, watching her reflection multiply in the mirrored walls. For 3 years, she had been content to be one person, competent, professional, slightly mysterious. But she was beginning to understand that mystery was a luxury that others controlled, and that silence could be interpreted as guilt as easily as discretion. By the time she reached the executive floor, she had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Some conversations required full disclosure, even when full disclosure changed everything. David Hartwell's office occupied the northeast corner of the 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Willamette River and the hills beyond. The space was designed to intimidate. Persian rugs over polished hardwood, oil paintings of stern-faced men in expensive suits, leather-bound books that looked more decorative than functional. Behind an imposing mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, sat a man who'd built his reputation on knowing exactly what everyone in his firm was worth. "Alina," Hartwell said without looking up from the document he was reviewing. At 63, he still possessed the sharp features and silver hair that had made him a formidable presence in boardrooms for over 3 decades. "Please, sit." She took the chair across from his desk, noting the calculated distance between them, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain hierarchy. Her briefcase rested against her leg like a faithful dog, its weight both comforting and dangerous. "I'm sure you can guess why I wanted to see you," Hartwell continued, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. They were pale blue, the color of winter sky, and they revealed nothing about his intentions. "I assume it has to do with the conversation Jessica had yesterday," Alina replied, choosing directness over diplomacy. She'd learned that with men like Hartwell, attempting to appear naive was more dangerous than appearing informed. Among other things. He leaned back in his chair, a movement that seemed casual, but felt calculated. "I received a rather interesting phone call this morning from Gerald Morrison at Pacific Northwest Financial. Apparently, there's been some discussion in the local investment community about compensation practices at this firm." Gerald Morrison. Alina knew the name. A competitor who'd tried to recruit her twice in the past 18 months, offering positions that would have been lateral moves with significantly less autonomy. His interest in her salary structure felt less like casual gossip and more like competitive intelligence gathering. "I see," she said, though what she saw was a web of connections and motivations that extended far beyond Jessica's lunch conversation. "Gerald was particularly interested in our senior analyst compensation," Hartwell continued. "He seemed to feel that we might be operating outside industry standards. Of course, I assured him that all our compensation decisions are based on performance and market conditions." The words hung in the air like a question wrapped in a statement. Hartwell was asking her to confirm his assurance, to provide him with the ammunition he needed to defend the firm's practices. But he was also probing, testing her response to indirect pressure. "My compensation is based on my performance," Alina said carefully. "I've consistently exceeded targets and generated significant value for our clients." "Yes," Hartwell agreed, though his tone suggested a qualification was coming. "Your performance has been exemplary. However, performance exists within context, and context, as I'm sure you understand, includes perception." There it was, the corporate euphemism that transformed gossip into business strategy. Perception wasn't reality, but in Hartwell's world, it often mattered more than facts. "What kind of perception are we discussing?" Alina asked, though she suspected she already knew.
The perception that certain employees might be receiving preferential treatment that isn't tied to traditional metrics. Hartwell's voice remained neutral, but his words carried an edge that made Alina's pulse quicken. "Clients invest with us based on trust, and trust requires transparency about how we operate." "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything." Hartwell leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes fixed on her face. "I'm explaining that when questions arise about compensation practices, they reflect on the entire firm. Our reputation is built on integrity and fairness, and anything that undermines that perception undermines our business." Alina felt the weight of her briefcase against her leg and made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. "Mr. Hartwell, there are some things about my situation that you should know." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or wariness. "What kind of things?" She reached for her briefcase, her hand steadier than she'd expected. "Documents that explain why traditional compensation metrics might not apply to my situation," she replied, watching his face as he opened the folder and began scanning the first page. His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His eyebrows lifted, his mouth opened slightly, and for the first time in their professional relationship, David Hartwell looked genuinely shocked. "When did this happen?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. 3 months before I started working here," Alina replied. "It's why I chose Hartwell and Associates specifically." Hartwell continued reading, his expression growing more complex with each page. She watched him process information that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about her motivations, her qualifications, and her right to occupy space in his firm. "My God," he said finally, looking up at her with something that might have been respect. "Why didn't you tell me this when you were hired?" "Because I wanted to be evaluated on my work, not my circumstances. I wanted to prove that I belonged here before revealing why I had additional reasons for being here." Hartwell closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his pale eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. "This changes things significantly." "Yes, it does. The questions about your compensation become irrelevant when people understand the full context, though I assume that context will raise other questions." "Undoubtedly." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that extended far beyond their individual conversation. "May I ask why you're sharing this now?" "Because silence is a choice, and I'm tired of letting other people control the narrative about my worth." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Margaret Thompson entered without waiting for permission, her usual composed expression replaced by something that looked like barely controlled panic. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. The IRS is in the building." Alina felt her stomach drop. The IRS? They're asking questions about tax documentation for several employees. They seem particularly interested in compensation records for senior-level positions.
Hartwell and Alina exchanged glances, both understanding immediately that the morning's gossip had escalated into something far more serious than office politics. "How many agents?" Hartwell asked. "3. They're setting up in conference room A and requesting files." Margaret's usually perfect composure was cracking under the pressure of managing a situation that had no precedent in her 20-year tenure with the firm. "Alina," Hartwell said, his voice carrying new urgency, "I need to ask you directly. Is there anything in your tax situation that would trigger an audit of this magnitude?" She thought about the documents in her briefcase, about the complex financial structures they represented, about the way money had flowed through various entities before reaching her compensation package. "It's possible," she admitted. "My situation involves some complicated tax implications." "How complicated?" "The kind that require very careful documentation and might appear unusual to someone who doesn't understand the full structure." Hartwell's expression darkened. "Are we talking about tax avoidance or tax evasion?" "Neither. We're talking about legitimate but complex financial arrangements that someone might have questions about if they only saw part of the picture." Before Hartwell could respond, his phone buzzed with an internal call. He answered with a terse "yes" and listened for 30 seconds before hanging up. "They want to see you," he said to Alina. "They specifically asked for you by name." The implications hit her like a physical blow. If the IRS was asking for her specifically, it meant their investigation wasn't random. Someone had provided them with information, detailed information, that went beyond Jessica's lunch conversation. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "there's something else you should know. I'm not sure I can handle another revelation today. The documents in that folder, they don't just explain my compensation structure, they explain why someone might want to use that structure against me." Hartwell's pale eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean that my situation involves more than just complex taxes. It involves ownership structures that some people might find inconvenient." "Ownership of what?" Alina took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. Not just for her, but potentially for everyone in the building. "Among other things," she said quietly, "I own 63% of this building." The silence that followed was so complete that Alina could hear the air conditioning system cycling on, the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below, and what might have been David Hartwell's heart skipping a beat. "You own," he began, then stopped, as if his brain was refusing to process the information. "The building, the one we're sitting in right now. I inherited it, along with several other properties, which is why my tax situation is complicated and why my compensation structure needed to be carefully designed to avoid conflicts of interest." Hartwell stared at her for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "You've been working for a firm that rents space in a building you own?" "Yes." "And you never thought to mention this?" "I wanted to establish myself professionally before revealing the extent of my financial interests. I thought it would be better for everyone if my capabilities were evaluated separately from my assets." Another knock interrupted them, this one more insistent. Margaret entered again, her expression grim. "Mr. Hartwell, the IRS agents are asking why Miss Chen hasn't come down yet. They said they've been waiting for 20 minutes. Alina stood up, straightening her blazer with hands that only trembled slightly. "I think it's time to answer their questions." "Alina," Hartwell said, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and calculation, Are you prepared for what this investigation might reveal? She thought about Jessica's carefully staged revelation, about Gerald Morrison's competitive interest, about the anonymous text message that suggested someone already knew her secrets. I think the real question is whether everyone else is prepared. As she headed for the door, Hartwell called after her. The documents in that folder, do they support everything you're claiming? They support much more than I'm claiming. The question is whether the truth will matter more than the perception of impropriety. Walking toward the elevator, Alina felt a strange sense of liberation. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of secrets that were never truly secret, managing perceptions that were based on incomplete information. Now, finally, all the cards would be on the table. The elevator doors opened and she stepped inside, watching her reflection multiply in the mirrored walls. But this time, she didn't see uncertainty or fear. She saw a woman walking toward a reckoning that was long overdue. As the elevator descended toward Conference Room A and 3 IRS agents who knew more about her situation than most of her colleagues, Alina realized that some battles could only be won by refusing to fight on other people's terms. The truth, it turned out, was about to become everyone's problem. Conference Room A had been transformed into a makeshift command center, with documents spread across the polished oak table like evidence at a crime scene. 3 IRS agents sat behind stacks of files and laptop computers, their expressions carrying the practiced neutrality of people accustomed to uncomfortable conversations about money. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looked up as Alina entered. "Miss Chen, I'm Agent Patricia Rodriguez. Thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat." Alina settled into the chair across from the agents, noting that David Hartwell had followed her into the room along with Margaret Thompson, who clutched a legal pad like a shield against whatever revelations were coming. "Miss Chen," Agent Rodriguez continued, "we're conducting a routine audit that has revealed some interesting discrepancies in compensation reporting for this firm. Your name has come up repeatedly in our review." "What kind of discrepancies?" Alina asked, though she suspected she already knew. Agent Rodriguez consulted her notes. "According to our records, your reported income for the past 3 years significantly exceeds what would be typical for someone in your position. We're trying to understand the source of that additional income." "My compensation is based on performance bonuses and profit-sharing arrangements that are legal and properly documented," Alina replied carefully. "Yes, we've seen the documentation for your salary and bonuses," said Agent Martinez, a younger man with the eager expression of someone still proving himself in his career. "But there are additional payments that don't seem to fit standard employment categories." Alina glanced at Hartwell, who nodded slightly, a signal that she had his support for whatever she was about to reveal. "Those payments are rental income from property holdings." "Property holdings?" Agent Rodriguez's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Can you be more specific?" "I own several commercial properties in the Portland area. The rental income from those properties is reported separately from my employment income." "Ms. Chen," Agent Rodriguez said slowly, "one of those properties appears to be the building we're currently sitting in. Is that correct?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody had noticed was burning. Alina could feel the weight of attention from everyone in the room, the agents processing implications for their investigation, Hartwell calculating the impact on his business relationships, Margaret probably wondering if she should be taking more detailed notes. "Yes," Alina said simply. "I own this building." Agent Martinez leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "And your employer, Hartwell and Associates, pays rent to you for office space?" "They pay rent to Meridian Property Holdings, which is my property management company. The arrangement predates my employment here." "By how much?" Agent Rodriguez asked. 3 months. The agents exchanged glances, and Alina could see them processing the timeline, the careful separation between her property acquisition and her job application, the legal distance between landlord and tenant relationships. Miss Chen, Agent Rodriguez continued, help us understand how someone in their early 30s comes to own a 42-story commercial building in downtown Portland. It was the question Alina had been expecting, the one that would require her to explain not just what she owned, but how she'd come to own it. I inherited the property, along with several others from my grandmother. Your grandmother owned commercial real estate? My grandmother owned many things. Alina opened her briefcase and pulled out a different folder, this one black leather with gold corners, the kind used for estate documents. She was a very successful businesswoman who preferred to keep her affairs private. Agent Rodriguez accepted the folder and began reviewing its contents, her expression growing more serious with each page. According to this documentation, your grandmother, Alina Chen, owns 17 commercial properties across Oregon and Washington, with a combined assessed value of $243 million, Alina finished, as of the last appraisal. The silence in the room was profound. Margaret Thompson's pen had stopped moving across her legal pad. David Hartwell sat perfectly still, as if moving might shatter the reality that was reshaping itself around them. Ms. Chen, Agent Martinez said carefully, one of those properties appears to be the building we're currently sitting in.
I chose to work as a financial analyst because I wanted to understand how money works before I started managing significant amounts of it, Alina replied. My grandmother always said that inheriting wealth without understanding its responsibilities was a recipe for losing both. Agent Rodriguez looked up from the documents. These properties generate substantial rental income. Why structure your compensation through employment rather than simply living off the rental income? It was a perceptive question that got to the heart of Alina's 3-year strategy. Because I wanted to prove that I could succeed on my own merit. I wanted to build professional credibility that wasn't dependent on my inheritance. But you did use the inheritance, Agent Martinez pointed out. The building lease payments effectively subsidize your salary. The lease payments are market rate, Alina countered. Hartwell and Associates pays the same rent they would pay to any commercial landlord. The fact that I'm that landlord doesn't change the legitimacy of their business expense or my rental income. David Hartwell finally spoke, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and concern. Alina, when you applied for the analyst position, you underwent the same salary negotiations as any candidate. You never mentioned that you were essentially negotiating with yourself. I wasn't negotiating with myself, she replied firmly. I was negotiating with my employer. The fact that my employer pays rent to a company I own doesn't invalidate the employment relationship. But it does create potential conflicts of interest, Agent Rodriguez observed. Your performance as an employee could theoretically be influenced by your interests as a landlord. Alina nodded, acknowledging the complexity. Which is why I structured everything through separate entities and disclosed the arrangement to my estate attorneys and tax advisors. Every payment, every transaction, every relationship has been documented to ensure legal compliance. Speaking of documentation, Agent Rodriguez said, we've reviewed your tax returns and everything appears to be properly reported. Your employment income, rental income, investment gains, it's all there. What triggered our investigation wasn't tax evasion. It was a tip from someone claiming you were engaged in fraudulent employment practices. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. A tip from whom? Hartwell asked. We can't reveal our sources, Agent Martinez replied, but someone contacted our fraud hotline claiming that Ms. Chen was receiving inflated compensation for work she wasn't qualified to perform. Alina felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Agent Rodriguez, when did you receive this tip? Yesterday afternoon, about 3 hours after we first heard about unusual salary structures at this firm. From whom did you first hear about salary structures? Agent Rodriguez consulted her notes. A call from someone in your HR department expressing concerns about pay equity. The caller suggested we might want to investigate whether certain employees were receiving preferential treatment. The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't pretty. Someone had orchestrated a sequence of events designed to trigger an investigation into her compensation, hoping that scrutiny would reveal impropriety or illegality. What they hadn't counted on was that scrutiny would reveal the opposite. A carefully structured arrangement that was entirely legal and far more complex than they had imagined. Agent Rodriguez, Alina said slowly, I think you should know that yesterday was the first time anyone in this office became aware of the specific details of my compensation package. My assistant shared that information with someone in HR who apparently shared it with your department. And with several people outside this firm, Hartwell added grimly, we've received calls from competitors expressing concern about our compensation practices.
Agent Martinez looked up from his laptop. Miss Chen, are you suggesting that someone deliberately triggered this investigation? I'm suggesting that someone tried to use your department as a weapon in what they thought was a case of corporate favoritism. What they didn't realize was that they were attacking someone who owns the building they're sitting in. Agent Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, processing implications that extended beyond tax compliance into areas of malicious reporting and potential fraud. Miss Chen, if someone filed a false report with the intent to harm your reputation or career, that's a federal offense. I understand that. Are you prepared to pursue charges if we determine that false information was provided to initiate this investigation? Alina thought about Jessica's carefully staged confession, about the anonymous text message, about the network of calls that had transformed office gossip into a federal investigation. I'm prepared to defend myself against false accusations, yes. The conference room door opened, and Jessica Winters entered with a stack of files, apparently unaware that she was walking into the center of a conversation about her actions. She stopped short when she saw the IRS agents and the documents spread across the table. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying surprise that seemed genuine. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were still meeting. Margaret asked me to bring the personnel files you requested." Agent Rodriguez looked at the files, then at Jessica, then at Alina. "Miss Winters, isn't it? We spoke briefly earlier." "Yes, that's right." "Miss Winters, you were the one who initially brought concerns about salary equity to HR, correct?" "I mentioned it in conversation, yes. I was concerned about fairness." "And you're Miss Chen's administrative assistant?" "Yes." Agent Rodriguez glanced at her notes. "How long have you been in that position?" 8 months. "And in that time, how would you characterize Miss Chen's work performance?" "She's very good at her job." "Very good how?" "She works long hours, her analyses are always accurate, clients respect her recommendations." "Have you observed anything that would suggest her compensation isn't justified by her performance?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "I just thought it seemed like a lot for someone who's been here 3 years." "Based on what comparison?" "I don't know, it just seemed like a lot." Agent Rodriguez made a note. "Miss Winters, when you shared information about Miss Chen's salary with HR, did you also share that information with anyone outside this firm?" The question hit Jessica like a physical blow. Her face flushed, and she glanced around the room as if looking for an escape route. "I don't think I should answer that without talking to a lawyer." "That's your right," Agent Rodriguez said calmly. "But I should mention that providing false information to federal investigators is a serious offense, and we have ways of verifying information through phone records and other documentation." Jessica's composure cracked completely. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just frustrated." "Frustrated about what?" "About working for someone who makes more in bonuses than I make in salary. Someone who got promoted faster than people who've been here longer." "So you decided to share confidential salary information with people outside this firm?" "I just mentioned it to a friend who works at Pacific Northwest Financial. I thought maybe they'd be interested in recruiting me if they knew what kind of salaries Hartwell was paying." The admission hung in the air like a confession at a trial.
Jessica had revealed confidential information not out of concern for equity, but as part of a job search strategy that had spiraled into a federal investigation. "Miss Winters," Agent Martinez said, "did your friend at Pacific Northwest Financial suggest that you should contact our fraud hotline?"
Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you were enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Jessica's silence was answer enough. David Hartwell stood up slowly, his face carrying the expression of someone who just watched his employee confess to industrial espionage. "Jessica, I think you should go clear out your desk." "Mr. Hartwell, I can explain." "I think you've explained enough." His voice carried a coldness that made the air conditioning seem tropical by comparison. After Jessica left, Agent Rodriguez turned back to Alina. "Miss Chen, it appears that this investigation was initiated under false pretenses. Your compensation structure is unusual, but entirely legal. And the source of the complaint seems to have been motivated by personal grievance rather than legitimate concern about tax compliance." "What happens now?" Alina asked. "Now we complete our review of the documentation, confirm that all tax obligations have been met, and close the investigation. We'll also be looking into whether charges should be filed for filing false reports with federal agencies." Agent Martinez closed his laptop and gathered his files. "Ms. Chen, for what it's worth, your tax documentation is some of the most thorough we've reviewed. Your attorneys clearly understand complex estate and business tax law." "Thank you." As the agents prepared to leave, Agent Rodriguez paused at the door. "Ms. Chen, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Why didn't you just live off the rental income from your properties? Why put yourself through 3 years of office politics and salary negotiations when you could have simply managed your inheritance?" Alina thought about her grandmother's kitchen table, about Rosa's advice about tending your own garden, about the woman she'd seen in the elevator mirror that morning. Because inheriting money doesn't teach you how to earn it. And I wanted to know that if I lost everything tomorrow, I'd still be able to take care of myself. Agent Rodriguez smiled, the first genuine expression she'd shown during the entire meeting. Your grandmother would be proud. After the agents left, Alina found herself alone in the conference room with David Hartwell, surrounded by the scattered evidence of secrets that were no longer secret. "So," Hartwell said finally, "my senior financial analyst owns the building I lease office space in." "Yes." "And she makes more money from rent than from salary?" "Yes." "And she's been allowing me to negotiate her compensation for 3 years without mentioning any of this." "I wanted to earn my position based on merit, not circumstances." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, staring out the conference room windows at the city spreading below them. "Alina, you realize this changes everything." "I know. The question is whether it changes everything for the better or for the worse." She looked at the documents still scattered across the table, evidence of wealth she'd never asked for, responsibilities she inherited along with assets, and a complexity that made simple answers impossible. "That depends," she said finally, "on whether you believe competence and ownership are mutually exclusive." Hartwell turned back to her, his pale eyes carrying something that might have been respect. "I suppose we're about to find out." 2 weeks after the IRS investigation concluded, Alina found herself standing in the same conference room where her secrets had been revealed. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating a table covered not with federal documents, but with architectural plans, financial projections, and blueprints for the future. David Hartwell sat across from her, along with Margaret Thompson and 3 senior partners she'd previously known only by reputation. The discussion wasn't about audits or accusations now. It was about opportunity and partnership, in forms none of them had imagined possible just weeks earlier. "The proposal is straightforward," Hartwell was saying, his voice carrying an energy that made him seem younger than his 63 years.
Hartwell and Associates becomes the exclusive investment management firm for Meridian Property Holdings. We handle the portfolio expansion, the financial planning, the strategic growth. In exchange, we get access to capital and investment opportunities that most firms our size could never consider. Alina reviewed the documents spread before them, noting the careful language that transformed a landlord-tenant relationship into a strategic partnership. It was elegant in its simplicity. She got professional management for her inherited assets. The firm got the resources to compete with much larger competitors. "The ethics review?" she asked, referring to the independent assessment they'd commissioned to ensure the arrangement met all regulatory requirements. "Clean," replied Patricia Eng, the senior partner who specialized in compliance issues. The review board found no conflicts of interest that aren't properly disclosed and managed through existing legal structures. Margaret Thompson looked up from her notes. "The staff response has been overwhelmingly positive. People are excited about the growth opportunities, the expanded client services we'll be able to offer." It was true. Once the initial shock of Alina's revelation had worn off, the practical implications had become clear to everyone in the firm. Access to significant capital meant they could pursue larger clients, develop more sophisticated investment products, and compete for business that had previously been beyond their reach. But the transformation hadn't been without its casualties. Jessica Winters had been terminated the day after the IRS meeting, her departure accompanied by legal documents that prohibited her from discussing confidential firm information with any third parties. The investigation into her reporting practices had revealed a pattern of information sharing with competitors that went far beyond salary gossip. She'd been systematically feeding business intelligence to Pacific Northwest Financial in exchange for promises of future employment that, as it turned out, were never sincere. "Has there been any fallout from the Morrison situation?" Alina asked, referring to the competitor who'd initiated the salary inquiries. "Gerald Morrison is no longer a concern," Hartwell replied with a satisfaction that suggested the resolution had been both swift and decisive. "It turns out that using industrial espionage to trigger federal investigations carries significant legal liability. His firm is dealing with their own regulatory review now." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. An attempt to undermine Alina's credibility had instead exposed a network of corporate espionage that implicated several firms in questionable competitive practices. The investigation that was supposed to destroy her reputation had enhanced it instead. 3 months later, Alina stood on the roof garden of the Meridian Financial Tower, as the building had been renamed, watching workers install solar panels that would make it the most energy-efficient commercial building in Portland. The renovation was part of a broader modernization plan that would transform not just the building, but the entire block around it. Rosa Delgado worked beside her, transplanting herbs from her corner market into raised beds that would supply the building's new cafe. At 74, Rosa moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that growth required patience and the right conditions. "You know, mija," Rosa said, pressing soil around a basil plant, "when you first started buying bananas from me, I could see you were carrying something heavy. I just didn't know it was a whole building." Alina laughed, a sound that came more easily now than it had 3 months ago. "I didn't know either, really. I mean, I knew about the inheritance, but I didn't understand what it meant to own something this big. And now? Now I'm learning that owning something means you're responsible for everyone who depends on it. The tenants, the employees, the community around it." Rosa nodded, wiping her hands on a towel embroidered with flowers her daughter had stitched. "Your grandmother understood that. She used to come to my store, back in the olden days, before she got sick." Alina stopped working, surprised by this connection she'd never known about. "You knew my grandmother?" "Elena? Of course. She bought vegetables every Tuesday for 15 years. Never asked for special treatment, never mentioned that she owned half the buildings on the street, just wanted good tomatoes and fair prices. She never told me she knew you." "She never told anybody much about what she did or what she owned, but she always treated people right. That's why when the landlords tried to raise my rent 3 years ago, I got a letter saying my lease was being extended at the same rate for 10 more years. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Alina's grandmother hadn't just owned buildings. She'd used that ownership to protect small businesses and community anchors like Rosa's Market. The inheritance hadn't just been about money, it had been about stewardship. Rosa, Alina said slowly, what would you think about expanding your market? Maybe opening a second location in the lobby of this building? Rosa's eyes lit up with possibilities. You mean that? I mean it. This building needs more than financial services. It needs a heart, a place where people can connect. Your market could be that place. That evening, Alina sat in her apartment. She had decided to stay in the same one-bedroom space despite her changed circumstances, reviewing reports from all 17 properties in her portfolio. Each building had its own story, its own community of tenants and local businesses, its own potential for positive impact. The Riverside Commons in Salem housed a community college extension program and 3 nonprofits focused on job training. The Harbor View complex in Astoria provided affordable housing for fishing industry workers. The Innovation Center in Beaverton had become a hub for technology startups that couldn't afford space in Portland's more expensive districts. Each property represented not just an asset, but a responsibility to provide safe, affordable space for the people and organizations that made communities function. It was a legacy her grandmother had built, quietly, without fanfare or recognition, understanding that true wealth was measured not in dollars, but in the positive impact those dollars could have. Her phone rang, interrupting her review. The caller ID showed Maya, her college roommate, who'd first alerted her to the salary gossip. So, Maya said without preamble, I hear you're not just a financial analyst anymore. I'm still a financial analyst, just one with a more complex portfolio to analyze. Alina, you own $250 million in real estate. You could retire tomorrow and live like royalty for the rest of your life. I could, but then what? Maya was quiet for a moment. What do you mean, then what? I mean, then what happens to the people who depend on these properties for their homes and their businesses? What happens to the community college programs and the job training centers and the small businesses that can only survive because they have affordable space? You hire a property management company and move to Maui.
Alina laughed, but it wasn't a bitter sound. That's not who I am, Maya. That's not who my grandmother raised me to be. Your grandmother expected you to work a regular job while managing a real estate empire? My grandmother expected me to understand that wealth without purpose is just an expensive way to be empty. After hanging up, Alina walked onto her balcony and looked out at the city spreading below her. From her vantage point, she could see several of her properties, buildings that housed thousands of people, provided space for hundreds of businesses, and generated economic activity that supported countless families. But she could also see the gaps. Vacant lots that could be developed for affordable housing, struggling commercial districts that needed investment, communities that lacked the resources to thrive. Her inheritance wasn't just about managing what existed, it was about using what existed to create something better. 6 months later, the transformation was evident throughout the city. The Meridian Community Development Initiative had launched with a $50 million commitment to affordable housing and small business development. Rosa's Market had opened its second location in the lobby of Meridian Financial Tower, becoming a gathering place for tenants and visitors alike. Hartwell & Associates had grown from a mid-sized regional firm to a nationally recognized investment management company, with Alina serving as both senior partner and director of community investment. Her dual role as financial professional and property owner had created opportunities for innovative investment strategies that generated both financial returns and social impact. The office dynamics had settled into something more honest than before. Without the artificial mystery around her compensation, conversations about pay and promotion had become more straightforward and equitable. Performance was measured by results rather than politics, and success was shared more broadly throughout the firm. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alina herself. The woman who'd once hidden in elevator mirrors now stood confidently in boardrooms and community meetings, articulating vision and strategy with the authority of someone who understood that true leadership meant using privilege to lift others up. Standing in the renovated conference room where her secrets had first been revealed, Alina looked at the architectural plans spread across the table, designs for a new mixed-use development that would provide affordable housing, commercial space for local businesses, and community meeting areas for neighborhood organizations. The financing structure is innovative but sound, she explained to the City Planning Commission members who'd come to review the proposal. By combining traditional development loans with community investment funds, we can deliver below-market housing while still generating sustainable returns. Commissioner Williams, a woman in her 50s who'd spent 2 decades advocating for affordable housing, leaned forward with interest. Ms. Chen, this level of community investment is unusual for private development. What's your long-term vision? My long-term vision is a city where economic success creates community benefit, where prosperity is shared rather than hoarded, where development strengthens neighborhoods instead of displacing them. And you believe this model can scale beyond Portland? I believe this model has to scale beyond Portland. The problems we're addressing, housing affordability, small business support, community economic development, these exist in every city. The question isn't whether we can afford to invest in solutions, it's whether we can afford not to.
After the meeting, David Hartwell walked with her to the elevator, the same elevator where her transformation had begun, with a 40-minute mechanical delay that had given her time to think about choices and consequences. "Alina," he said as they waited for the doors to open, "I have to ask you something I've been wondering about for months." "What's that?" "Do you ever regret not revealing your circumstances from the beginning? Think about how different these 3 years would have been if everyone had known who you were from day one." Alina considered the question as they stepped into the elevator, watching their reflections multiply in the mirrored walls. "David, if I'd revealed everything from the beginning, people would have seen me as an owner playing at being an employee. They would have questioned every decision, every promotion, every success. I would never have known whether I was truly capable of this work or just protected by my circumstances. And now you know? Now I know that I earned my place here before anyone knew what I owned. I know that my value as a professional isn't dependent on my inheritance. And I know that I can use both my skills and my resources to create something bigger than either could accomplish alone." The elevator reached the ground floor, and as the doors opened, Alina could see Rosa arranging fresh flowers in the lobby market, creating beauty and community in a space that had once been purely transactional. Employees from various companies in the building stopped to buy lunch and exchange pleasantries, creating the kind of human connections that made work feel less like work. "Besides," Alina added, stepping into the lobby that had become a symbol of her approach to wealth and responsibility, "some lessons can only be learned by taking the long path. The shortcuts might be faster, but they don't teach you what you need to know to handle success when it comes." That evening, Alina sat in her apartment. She'd finally decided to move to a larger space, but only to the building next door, which she also owned, reviewing applications for the newly established Alina Chen Fellowship Program. Named for her grandmother, the fellowship provided financial support and mentorship for young professionals from underrepresented communities who wanted to build careers in finance and real estate development. The applications told stories that reminded her of her own journey. Young people with more ambition than opportunity, brilliant minds constrained by financial circumstances, dreamers who needed someone to invest in their potential rather than their pedigree. Among the applications was one from Marcus, the maintenance worker who'd been so helpful during her elevator incident. He was completing his business degree at night school and wanted to transition into property management. His essay about understanding buildings from the ground up had made her smile. Another application came from Sarah Martinez, the HR representative who'd initially questioned Alina's compensation. After Jessica's termination and the subsequent investigation into industrial espionage, Sarah had approached Alina with a formal apology and a request for mentorship. Her application essay focused on learning to distinguish between legitimate equity concerns and personal resentment. Alina approved both applications, understanding that second chances were often more valuable than first impressions. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the news about your development project. Impressive work. Some people said you'd never amount to anything without help. Guess they were wrong." She deleted the message without responding, but not without noting the irony. The same anonymity that once felt threatening now felt irrelevant. When your work spoke for itself, other people's opinions became background noise.
As she prepared for bed, Alina walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the city lights spreading to the horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: zoning meetings for the affordable housing project, interviews with potential fellowship recipients, strategic planning sessions for the next phase of community development. But tonight, she felt the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Her grandmother's legacy wasn't just about buildings and bank accounts. It was about understanding that true wealth was measured in lives improved, communities strengthened, and opportunities created for others. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing lives and dreams and possibilities that good work and shared prosperity could help fulfill. And for the first time since inheriting her grandmother's empire, Alina felt truly worthy of the responsibility that had been placed in her hands. 3 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Portland Business Journal's editorial offices as reporter James Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, put the finishing touches on a feature story that would run the following week. The headline read, "The Accidental Empire: How One Woman's Secret Inheritance Transformed Portland's Development Landscape." His desk was covered with documents, photographs, and interview notes that told a story more complex and inspiring than he'd initially expected when his editor assigned him to investigate the woman behind Portland's most ambitious community development initiatives. "What started as office gossip about inflated salaries," he wrote, "evolved into a case study in how wealth can be wielded as a tool for community transformation rather than personal enrichment." 3 years after the IRS investigation that revealed Alina Chen's hidden real estate empire, her approach to development has influenced policy discussions from Seattle to San Francisco. The numbers were impressive. Since 2025, the Meridian Community Development Initiative had created 847 units of affordable housing, supported 312 small businesses through below-market commercial leases, and generated an estimated $73 million in local economic activity. But the statistics only told part of the story. James had spent weeks interviewing people whose lives had been touched by Alina's work. There was Maria Santos, a single mother who'd been able to start her catering business thanks to affordable kitchen space in a Meridian property. There was David Kim, a veteran who'd found both housing and job training through programs funded by the Alina Chen Fellowship. There were dozens of stories like these. Individual lives improved through systematic investment in community infrastructure. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his writing. "James Chen, Portland Business Journal." "This is Patricia Rodriguez from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I understand you're writing about the Alina Chen case." James straightened in his chair. Agent Rodriguez had been one of the federal investigators who'd originally audited Chen's finances, and her perspective would add credibility to his reporting. "Yes, ma'am. I'm hoping to provide context about how that investigation influenced her subsequent work." "I've been following Ms. Chen's development projects with interest," Rodriguez said. "In 20 years of financial investigations, I've rarely seen someone use wealth disclosure as a catalyst for community benefit rather than personal protection." "Can you elaborate on that?" "Most people in Ms. Chen's situation would have used their resources to minimize scrutiny and maintain privacy. Instead, she used public revelation as an opportunity to demonstrate how inherited wealth could generate community value. It's an unusual approach that's had measurable impact." James made notes as they talked, understanding that Rodriguez's professional endorsement would carry significant weight with readers who might otherwise dismiss Chen's work as privileged guilt management. After hanging up, he returned to his writing, trying to capture the complexity of a story that defied easy categorization. Chen wasn't a typical philanthropist. She was a businesswoman who'd found ways to make social impact profitable. She wasn't a traditional activist. She was a property owner who'd discovered that community investment generated better long-term returns than extraction strategies. 5 years later, the university lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in the aisles and leaning against walls to hear Alina speak about sustainable development finance. At 39, she'd become a nationally recognized expert on community-centered investment strategies, regularly consulted by municipal governments and development firms seeking to replicate Portland's success. The fundamental misconception about inherited wealth, she was saying to the graduate students in the real estate development program, is that it's either a burden to be managed or a privilege to be enjoyed. But wealth, any wealth, earned or inherited, is actually a responsibility to be exercised thoughtfully. A student in the front row raised her hand. Miss Chen, critics have argued that your model only works because you had access to capital that most developers don't have. How do you respond to claims that your approach isn't scalable? It was a question Alina had heard dozens of times, and she'd developed a nuanced answer that acknowledged both the privilege and the principles involved. You're absolutely right that I had access to capital that most developers don't have, but that capital was only valuable because it was deployed strategically. The principles we've developed, community engagement, long-term thinking, measuring success by social impact as well as financial returns, these don't require inherited wealth. They require commitment to seeing development as community building rather than just profit generation. Another student, this one older and clearly a working professional attending evening classes, spoke up. But doesn't community-centered development generate lower returns? How do you attract investors who are focused primarily on profit? That's where the data becomes interesting, Alina said, clicking to a slide that showed 10-year return comparisons. Community-centered development generates higher long-term returns because it creates more stable tenant relationships, reduces vacancy rates, and benefits from property value increases driven by neighborhood improvement. The key is convincing investors to think beyond quarterly results. After the lecture, as students gathered around to ask individual questions, Alina noticed a young woman waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd. She looked familiar, though Alina couldn't immediately place her. When the crowd thinned, the woman approached with a nervous smile. "Miss Chen, I'm not sure if you remember me. I'm Jessica Winters. I used to work as your assistant at Hartwell and Associates." The recognition was immediate, though the woman standing before her looked different from the one who'd sat in her office 5 years earlier, confessing to salary gossip that had triggered a federal investigation. This Jessica looked more mature, more confident, carrying herself with the bearing of someone who'd learned from difficult experiences. "Jessica," Alina said, genuinely surprised, "how are you?" "I'm well, thank you. I wanted to apologize again for what happened back then and to thank you." "Thank me?" "For not pressing charges, for giving me a chance to learn from my mistakes rather than just punishing me for them." Alina studied her former assistant's face, noting the sincerity that seemed deeper and more genuine than anything she'd seen during their working relationship. "What have you been doing since then?" "I completed a master's degree in nonprofit management and spent 3 years working for a housing advocacy organization in Seattle. Now I'm back in Portland, working for the city planning department on affordable housing policy." "And you're taking real estate development classes because—" Jessica smiled, and this time it was free of the calculated quality that had characterized her professional expressions years earlier. "Because I realize that understanding how development actually works is essential to creating policy that actually helps people. Your lecture tonight was exactly the kind of practical wisdom I need to be effective in my job." They talked for another 10 minutes, and by the end of the conversation, Alina found herself impressed by the transformation. The woman who'd once leaked confidential information out of professional frustration had become someone committed to using policy and advocacy to address the systemic issues that created frustration for others. Jessica, Alina said as they prepared to part ways, the city planning department is working on new inclusionary zoning policies, aren't they?
Yes, we're trying to create requirements for affordable units in all new residential development. I'd be happy to share some data about how those policies have worked in other cities and how developer incentives can be structured to encourage compliance rather than avoidance. Jessica's eyes lit up with possibilities. That would be incredibly helpful. Would you consider presenting to our policy working group? I'd be happy to. As they exchanged contact information, Alina reflected on the unpredictable ways that conflict could evolve into collaboration when people were willing to learn and grow from their mistakes. The morning of Alina's 40th birthday found her standing in the executive boardroom of the newly constructed Alina Chen Center for Community Development, a gleaming testament to sustainable architecture that had become Portland's most recognizable landmark. Through floor-to-ceiling windows made from recycled glass, she could see the city she'd helped reshape through a decade of patient, strategic investment. The meeting table was surrounded by faces that told the story of her journey. David Hartwell, now in his 70s but still sharp as a blade, serving as chairman emeritus of what had become the largest community-focused development firm on the West Coast. Rosa Delgado's daughter Carmen had taken over her mother's market empire and now oversaw food operations in 12 Meridian buildings. Marcus, the former maintenance worker, sat as director of property operations, his night school business degree having evolved into an MBA and a reputation as one of the most innovative property managers in the region. The Portland model is being adopted in 17 cities now, reported Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had transformed from an HR representative questioning salary equity into a nationally recognized expert on equitable development and community investment. Her research on equitable development had influenced policy from city halls to corporate boardrooms across the country. But it was the newest member of their team who represented the most profound transformation of all. Jessica Winters, now 35 and carrying the title of Director of Policy Integration, was presenting data that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. The longitudinal study results are remarkable, Jessica was saying, her confidence evident as she clicked through slides showing economic impact data. Cities that have implemented community-centered development policies show 43% higher job creation rates, 27% greater small business retention, and housing affordability metrics that consistently outperform traditional development models. Alina watched Jessica present with a mixture of professional pride and personal satisfaction. The woman who had once leaked salary information out of frustration had become one of the nation's leading advocates for transparent, equitable development practices. Her journey from gossip to genuine expertise illustrated something Alina had learned repeatedly over the past decade. People could change when given the opportunity to grow rather than simply being punished for their mistakes.
The question we're facing now, Jessica continued, is how to scale these policies to metropolitan areas with populations over 2 million. The Seattle Planning Commission has requested a comprehensive implementation plan, and San Francisco is considering legislation based on our affordability housing requirements. David Hartwell leaned forward, his pale eyes still sharp despite his age. Alina, when you first revealed your building ownership in that conference room 10 years ago, did you imagine we'd be advising major cities on development policy? She considered the question, thinking back to that day when her carefully maintained professional anonymity had crumbled under the weight of federal investigation and workplace betrayal. I imagined we'd find a way to make the arrangement work legally and ethically. I never imagined we'd discover that community investment could be more profitable than traditional extraction models. But you must have had some vision of what was possible, Carmen Delgado interjected. The Alina Chen Fellowship Program alone has graduated over 400 professionals who are now working in community development across the country. The fellowship program was my grandmother's vision, not mine.
She understood that sustainable wealth required investing in people, not just property. I just figured out how to implement her philosophy systematically. The meeting continued for another hour, covering expansion plans, policy recommendations, and the upcoming publication of Alina's book, Inherited Responsibility, A Decade of Community-Centered Development, which had already generated interest from urban planning programs and business schools nationwide. As the team filed out to return to their various responsibilities, Jessica lingered behind, clearly wanting a private word. "Alina," she said when they were alone, "I've been thinking about something you said in that university lecture 5 years ago, about wealth being a responsibility to be exercised thoughtfully." "What about it?" "I never inherited wealth, but I did inherit advantages. Education, family connections, opportunities that others didn't have. I spent years resenting people like you who seemed to have more advantages, without recognizing the ones I'd been given." Alina nodded, understanding the direction of Jessica's reflection. It was a conversation she'd had with many people over the years, as the community development model had attracted professionals from diverse backgrounds who were grappling with questions about privilege, responsibility, and social impact. "What I've learned," Jessica continued, "is that the size of your advantages matters less than what you choose to do with them. You could have used your inheritance to live in luxury and isolation. Instead, you used it to create opportunities for others. And you could have let your mistakes define your career. Instead, you use them as motivation to become someone who helps create systems that prevent others from facing the same frustrations you experienced." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city that had been transformed not just by buildings and policies, but by the accumulated choices of individuals who had decided to use their privileges, whatever they were, in service of something larger than themselves. "Jessica," Alina said finally, "can I ask you something I've always wondered about?" "Of course." "That anonymous text I received during the investigation, the one about people knowing the whole truth, was that from you?" Jessica's face flushed slightly, but she met Alina's eyes directly. "Yes, I was afraid that if you didn't reveal everything, the investigation would drag on and hurt innocent people. I thought maybe if you knew that someone suspected there was more to the story, you'd find the courage to tell it completely. So even when you were working against me, you were also working to protect the firm?" "I was confused and angry and making terrible decisions, but I never wanted to see good people get hurt because of my mistakes." Alina smiled, finally understanding the complexity of motivations that had driven events a decade earlier. "That text message was actually what convinced me to bring the documents to David's office. In a strange way, your attempt to pressure me into disclosure probably saved my career." As they prepared to leave, Jessica paused at the conference room door. "Alina, do you think we would have become colleagues if things had happened differently back then?" "I think we became colleagues because of how things happened," Alina replied. "Sometimes the hardest lessons create the strongest foundations." That evening, Alina sat in her penthouse apartment. She had eventually accepted that her changed circumstances warranted changed living arrangements. Reviewing applications for the latest Alina Chen Fellowship cohort, the program had evolved from supporting individual professionals to funding entire community development initiatives led by fellowship alumni. Among the applications was one from a young man in Detroit who wanted to use community land trusts to prevent gentrification displacement. Another came from a woman in Phoenix who had developed innovative financing models for solar installations in low-income neighborhoods. A third application outlined a plan for converting abandoned shopping malls into mixed-use community centers. Each application represented not just individual ambition, but systemic thinking, proposals that addressed root causes rather than symptoms, that built community wealth rather than extracting it, that recognized development as an opportunity for shared prosperity rather than zero-sum competition. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya, her college roommate who had become a successful investment advisor in San Francisco. "Saw the Times article about your book deal. When did you become a celebrity?"
I'm not a celebrity. I'm a businesswoman who figured out that doing good work and doing well financially aren't mutually exclusive. Same thing, really. Listen, I have clients who are interested in the community development model. Any chance you'd consult on a project in Oakland? Send me the details. As she set down her phone, Alina reflected on how dramatically her world had expanded since that morning 10 years ago when she'd been trapped in an elevator, wondering whether she had the courage to reveal the truth about her circumstances. The woman who had once hidden behind professional anonymity now regularly appeared on panels, spoke at conferences, and advised governments on policy development. But the core of her work remained the same: using resources thoughtfully to create opportunities for others, understanding that sustainable success required community benefit, and recognizing that wealth, however acquired, came with responsibilities that extended far beyond individual comfort. The city lights twinkled beyond her windows, each one representing lives and dreams and possibilities that good work and shared prosperity could help fulfill. And for the first time since inheriting her grandmother's empire, Alina felt not just worthy of the responsibility that had been placed in her hands, but grateful for the journey that had taught her how to wield it wisely. Her grandmother's lesson had been proven over and over again. True wealth was measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives improved, communities strengthened, and opportunities created for others to discover their own potential for positive impact. The story that had begun with leaked salary information and federal investigation had become something larger, a testament to the transformative power of choosing transparency over exception. Secrecy, community benefit over individual advantage, and long-term impact over short-term comfort.